ready? Do you want to introduce this week?
Your turn.
I did last week.
Okay.
Hello, are we good?
Yeah.
Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the school podcast. We are joined by Mr. Rogers and Dr. Tim Dean, I should say, not Mr. Doctor. So, Dr. Tim Dean, tell us about yourself.
So I'm a philosopher,
Yes.
and I've also worked as a journalist in the past. So I've been a science journalist and worked at a number of different magazines and websites. I used to work on a magazine called Cosmos, if you've ever heard that, and I've worked at a website called The Conversation, doing the science and technology desk there. But philosophy has been my interest and my passion since I was a kid, really. And I studied philosophy in my undergraduate. Finished uni, went and worked as a journalist, but I always wanted to go back and do my PhD, which I did about 10 years ago.
Yep.
And when I finished that, I decided that I wanted to combine my philosophy and kind of journalism and communications abilities and kind of bring them together and do something to get philosophy out into the general public. And so that's what I'm doing today. So I do a few lectures from here and there. I do a bit of work in schools increasingly, which is why I'm so thrilled to be here this week. I also do some writing for the media. I do a little bit of radio and things for the ABC. And I also work with some organisations as a kind of a writer and a freelance thinker as well. So I'm juggling a lot of different things, but they're all kind of basically themed around this idea of getting philosophy out of the academic world and out into the public.
So did you first discover philosophy at school or at university? Or?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. And I've got a theory. I actually think you don't really choose to be a philosopher. You kind of discover that you are one.
Really?
Right. So I've always just been asking questions. I've always just been curious as to how the world works and why things are the way they are, and also why things aren't the way they're not. I think this is just as important a question. And I suppose, when you're kids, you ask those why questions all the time. And it just got to a point where I wasn't a kid anymore, when I was still asking those questions. And so that's why when I started university, I actually started studying psychology and did philosophy as just a minor.
Yep.
And I found that actually the philosophy, I just loved those questions. I loved that kind of thinking, exploring those spaces. And so I shifted over full time and made that my major. And so it's always been there, I think. It's just now that I'm able to make a living out of it.
Do you think philosophy should be compulsory in school? Or do you think it should be an optional subject that the children choose?
Do you think the way that the curriculum nowadays, is that the way to go about it, in your opinion?
Yeah, look, and that's a complex question because I certainly would say that philosophy is really valuable for everybody. Like, one of the things I usually say is, whenever you make an argument to try to convince someone of something, you're doing philosophy.
Yeah.
Whenever you try to change someone's mind, you're doing philosophy. Whenever you try to make sense of a situation when there's kind of ambiguity or there's different distinctions or there's a bit of blurriness around the concepts that you're using and you try to clarify them, you're doing philosophy. Every time you make a judgment about what's right or wrong or something that's beautiful or not beautiful, you're kind of doing philosophy. So I actually think we're doing philosophy all the time, and we're doing it in all of the subjects that we're doing already in school. That kind of thinking, teasing apart ideas, teasing apart concepts, using reason. There's philosophy already in a lot of things that we're doing in school. What I would really like to see is philosophy brought to the fore a little bit more. Now, that could be done as like a dedicated subject, or that could be something that's woven in to the subjects that are already using these kinds of things, just some extra types of tools. But really, from this perspective, all philosophy is a process. It's a way of thinking. It's a particular way of reasoning things out, of clarifying things, of finding implications and consequences and contradictions and all that kind of stuff. And I think that can be applied across the board. Now, whether that should be a discrete subject, which means that you might have to find room somewhere and boot another subject out, I don't know, right? That's a difficult decision. Or whether that's something that can be folded into lots of different areas. I'm really happy for different education bodies to figure out the best solution for them, but I do think there's a lot of value in it.
What do you think, Mr. Rogers, as a philosophy teacher?
I knew you were going to come to me on this one. I'm sitting here thinking of a response. I support an awful lot of what Tim said. We're very fortunate here at St Mark's because we actually offer it in both ways, which I don't think that's done very often in a lot of schools. So we offer it as a standalone subject in years 10, 11 and 12. So students can opt in and choose to specialise. But certainly lower down the school, we've now got an awful lot of teachers who are trained and more becoming increasingly trained in the philosophical approach to teaching. The critical and creative thinking aspect, the community inquiry model that many classroom teachers use, and that's really effective. So I mean that's used in English and humanities, and even Mr. Neeble's been using it in science. So I mean it's really going across all avenues. So I like what we do here. I think that's a good model.
All right. Next question. All right. Do you think philosophy is being represented well here at St. Mark's with your experience of here 2 days? Has it been?
Yeah, so this is my second day
2 days,
here.
yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. Look, I'm really impressed so far with what I've seen of the commitment to philosophy at St. Mark's. And it certainly seems to be a stronger commitment and a stronger emphasis on it and some more expertise in the teaching of it than I've seen at other schools. So yeah, definitely. I think it's really impressive the kind of work that is going on here in trying to bring philosophy to the fore. And I really hope and I expect that the students will see the benefit from it. I think that's the benefit that's not only going to help with the subjects that you're doing and the marks that you get, helping you kind of think through those kinds of problems, but it's stuff that I think you're going to be able to take with you out into the world. And whatever you're going to do, this is one of the benefits of philosophy, is it's something you can apply to just about anything. Clear thinking. Like, as a rule, I think no matter what problem you have to solve, it's harder to solve if you can't think and talk about it clearly. Yep. And you can't do that in a respectful way to be able to bring the right kind of ideas to the surface. And we know, right? When you look out into the world and you look at the media, how difficult and how bad people generally are at that kind of a conversation.
Yeah.
So these skills, I think that you're learning here, are fantastic, and they're going to be a benefit to you wherever you go.
Awesome.
Can I turn the question around on you guys?
Sure.
What do you think? Because I mean, you're the customer. You guys are coming to the end of year 12. Both of you, Nathan, I don't think you did, but certainly both of you guys have done philosophy from you did it year 10. You've carried it on through to year 12.
Yeah.
What are your impressions?
It felt different than other classes.
Yeah. In what way?
Because I felt like there was less of a, this is the curriculum.
Yeah, less of a focus of get this information into you so you can repeat it on a test, piece of paper. It's more engages you with critical thinking, interpersonal skills, problem solving, and it's more. There's less. What's the word? Restrictions, limitations.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more open to.
For instance, in history, it's it happened. That's just what happened.
Yeah.
And it's just, this is what happened, this is why it happened, and it's cool and I love it, but in philosophy, it's just different. It's like, why did it happen? Why would someone do this? Sort of thing.
Well, you seem satisfied customers anyway. I mean, have you seen the benefit in your other subject areas? I mean, can you employ some of the philosophical ideas, for instance, in your history? Can you use it in your economics and things like that?
I reckon literature definitely, history definitely, economics. Not so much, but with those two subjects,
Sure.
definitely. I'm just the way I think about arguing a point and trying to answer a question. Yeah, philosophy has definitely helped me with that, I would say.
So I think that then supports your idea of it being done discreetly. The skills that are able to bring it out is really important as well. But then the knowledge that you've gained, the underpinning of that has also helped too. So, well, that's good. Thank you. Good answer.
Awesome. Do you want to ask a question?
Should we bring up your own podcast?
Oh, sure. Okay.
The meaning of.
Yeah, okay. Do you want me to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, like the origins of it.
Yeah, sure. So I've been producing a podcast for a couple of years. We've got 2 seasons out of 10 episodes each, and they're about, I think, 45 minutes long. We were aiming to have them to be about half an hour long, but when we get going, it's really hard to stop.
Yeah.
So the podcast came about because a very good friend of mine, a very old friend of mine, Monty Badami, he's an anthropologist. So he studies human culture. And he and I we did our undergraduate degrees together at Macquarie University in Sydney, and that's where we met. So we met when we were probably about 18 years old, 19 years old. And we've been friends ever since. And we studied from 2 very different kind of philosophical perspectives. We drew upon different kinds of theories and ideas and literature. So I came from a very kind of analytic, rational, scientific perspective. And he came from a more, what's often called a continental philosophical perspective, which is a more sociological, cultural perspective that looks at more diverse views and takes more diverse views in, rather than saying that reason can kind of get us to some clearer answers about things. He was more skeptical about the role of reason. So we actually overlap in a lot of ways, but we disagree about a lot of things. And it was funny because we were catching up over lunch sometime and we were having a long argument, as we often do, about some aspect of human nature or something like that. And our wives were both there, and our wives said, you know, you guys do this every time we meet. You get together and you argue for hours, and they said, it's actually quite interesting to listen to. You should make a podcast. So we did. We basically just took the conversations that we have over the barbecue or whatever and put it on air. And so we pick a topic, and it's called The Meaning of ... because we pick something each time. It might be love, it could be death, it could be gender, it could be speech, free speech, all these different subjects that we come up with, religion, etc. And we just kind of try to find what the meaning is in it. Where do we find meaning in these things? Why are these things so significant? How do they affect our lives? And what are the theories that come from all these different schools of thought that can help us understand them? And one of the functions of the podcast that we wanted there to be is just to kind of hear about these different ideas. And so he usually teaches me things. I usually teach him things when we're talking as well. That's great. But the other thing that we wanted to show is that because we disagree with each other so much, we wanted to show that it's possible to disagree well. We wanted to show that he and I can both have these well-informed views and we can still disagree with each other, but we can still do that in a civil kind of way. And we don't make that the main theme of the podcast, but we want that to show through, that it's not just two people agreeing with each other all the time. It's possible to have a kind of a rich, thorough disagreement and walk away better off. And so that's a part of the idea behind it as well.
What has been your favourite podcast to record then?
Of the series that we've recorded? Oh, geez. I don't know. They've all been... all of them, I come out of them and I'm like, man, that was amazing. That was really interesting. I learned so much. Man, that was really frustrating. There was a lot of stuff that I wish I'd said that I didn't say. Yeah. And there's like, I wish we could have talked about this for like an hour or 2 hours. Look, I think the stuff that we did on like sex and gender, what it is to be a man or a woman, what it is to be male or female, how our biology informs that, how culture informs that, what are the expectations that are placed upon us by the way other people see us based upon their readings of our sex or our gender. Now that's an area that my area of philosophy, I suppose I haven't studied that area as much. So I learned a lot from what Monty had to say about that and what he had to say about the perceptions and power and these other kinds of things that taught me a lot about that. So I really enjoyed recording those episodes because it helped me kind of learn some things. I mean, and from my perspective, I also really enjoyed doing the one on morality. So my area of philosophy, my area of research in philosophy was really looking at evolution and how we've evolved as a species from being a relatively slightly antisocial species of ape to being the much more social species that we are right now, and how morality has featured in that process. So how evolution's contributed to morality and how morality has contributed to shaping who we are as well. So how it goes both ways. So having that episode was great because I got to kind of share some of my views and some of the work that I've done and see how that differs actually and is similar to some of the work that Monty's done as well. So I don't know, there's probably lots that I've enjoyed as well.
So what were some of your favourite views or arguments to do with morality then?
So, I could go for hours.
Yes.
Look, one thing that I find really interesting is we tend to think about morality as being a right and wrong kind of thing, right? When someone does something we think is morally wrong, we want to say you're wrong for a reason. And we want that reason to be persuasive. Like there is a kind of if not a black and white, there's at least good reasons to say that this is definitely wrong and this is definitely right. We all kind of feel that way. That like if I think murder is wrong, it's not just that I don't like it, it's that it's wrong for everybody. And that if I think it's wrong, then I think you should think it's wrong as well. But the thing is, the actual views that people have vary tremendously across cultures, across history, even within cultures, across the dinner table at your own family. You can have these disagreements about what's right and what's wrong. So I'm really interested in that tension between our desire for morality to be kind of objective and factual and almost like a science, so we can research things and figure out the way the world is and find the right answers to these things, and the tension between that and the fact that there's such diversity of things in the world. And so something that really persuaded me when I was researching this for my own PhD was the idea that maybe morality is not black and white. Maybe it's not objective. Maybe it's not real and out in the world like science and we can just study it. Maybe it is something that we make up. Maybe it's something that we've negotiated amongst ourselves in order to find some rules that we can live by. And because it's made up by ourselves, the rules that we live by are probably going to vary depending on where we live. If we live in a tribal society and as hunter-gatherers, it might be one set of rules. If we live in an agricultural society, it might be a different set of rules. If we live in a massive high-tech society with massive information and communication technology, it might be a different set of rules. And how some of our disagreements might be that we kind of have carried rules from one environment into a new one and they haven't adapted or evolved yet. So when I started thinking this way, it made morality seem a lot more like a human technology, like a cultural technology that we use to get along and live together in harmony with each other. And it opens it up to negotiation. But it also opens it up to power. It means that those who are powerful can kind of negotiate, have greater weight in the negotiations and subvert the morality to support their own interests. And it completely changes the way we think about morality from being something that we discover, we can think about or figure out what's right and wrong, to something we negotiate. And that is a really big shift for me in how I thought about morality. And that's something that actually Monty and I agree upon, is that it's not a black and white thing. We can't just figure it out and say, everyone should abide by these rules. It's something that all cultures negotiate. And it doesn't mean that it's anything goes. It doesn't mean that any rules just, are forgivable. There's still better and worse ways to live. But there seems to be a lot more flexibility in the way that we think about morality. It makes it a lot more complicated, a lot more frustrating. But to me, also, I think we're starting to get a bit closer to the way morality actually works.
Can I ask a question at this point?
Of
because
course,
I'm just hanging off your every word because it's very not dissimilar to what we were talking about in class the other day. I'm just curious about how that we're increasingly moving towards a global community where we interact a lot more with different countries, about issues, climate change, for instance. That approach makes a lot of sense. Is there any sort of way to come to any solutions about how we can compromise and work together, or is it always going to be no, we're over here and we're over here, and there's no way we're going to ever be able to meet?
Yeah, look, and that's such an important question, because if it is a negotiation, then we do need to find a way to negotiate effectively. And we need to do that in a way that's not just going to mean the most powerful people are going to be able to impose their rules upon everybody else. And when it comes to an issue like climate change, it's really, really difficult because the effects of our actions affect the whole world.
That's right.
And we might say we have a moral responsibility to act in a different way, but then if we act and we take we reduce our economic output or something, or we take a cost onto ourselves, and other people don't, then we can be feeling like there's a free riding situation here, and so it really is this devilish moral problem. But I think we can learn a lot from the way that we have evolved morally in the past. And one of the things that has encouraged groups to come together and agree upon things has been an external threat. So when we look at how small communities have banded together, it's often because there's been another population nearby that is threatening them. They've been raiding them or invading them or stealing their things. So this community needs to really come together as a unit and cooperate and be altruistic and be supportive of each other in order to... It's kind of almost an ironic situation that war and conflict has made us peaceful and altruistic, at least peaceful and altruistic within our groups. And over history, the size of those groups have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's this external threat that can actually sometimes cause us to band together to solve it. Now, I would think maybe climate change would be such a threat that would bring humanity together to see this as something that we can work together for. And I think it's a really interesting thing that it hasn't done that. So I once wrote a thing as a speculation of what if scientists suddenly said, oh yeah, we've just discovered a comet hurtling straight towards the Earth. There's a 40% chance that it's going to hit the Earth, but we can't be absolutely sure right now. But if it does hit the Earth, it's going to be devastating. It's going to have all these really huge negative effects. What would we do? I think most of the world would band together and want to do something about that. Even at great cost, we'd want to try to redirect it or send a rocket up or whatever it is, whatever the movie scenarios are of blowing it up.
Armageddon.
Deep Impact, Armageddon. I actually think Deep Impact's a better film. We can debate that later. I think the world would come together, and you could make that same situation except with climate change. There's a 40% chance or whatever percentage chance you want to say, and it's going to cause these devastating things, and the world isn't coming together. There's something interestingly different about that. So, I mean, I wish I knew the answer around that, how to get it together. But I think in general, when it comes to negotiation around what is moral, I think there are better and worse answers to a lot of moral questions. And so we can look at things like, so a hedonist would want to say how much happiness there is in the world, or I lean a bit more Epicurean, based on Epicurus, the Greek philosopher, who says that it's not increasing pleasure that is going to make life better, it's decreasing suffering. So maybe if we can agree upon some metric that is going to, around well-being or something like that, there are better and worse ways to promote that kind of well-being. And so there are better and worse ways to solving the kinds of problems of social living that we have, like free riding and social disruption. And I think those problems might vary in certain environments, but the nature of those problems we understand quite well, and I think we can make progress on those kinds of things. In fact, I think just about all the kinds of problems that we have a number of solutions for them. It's not coming up with new solutions, it's coming up with agreement over them. So the big problem is not trying to find solutions for something like inequality or climate change. There are actually lots of solutions. It's finding agreement, and that to me is a really, really challenging part of the negotiation. Is not getting a good answer, is trying to get everyone to agree on that answer. And I don't know how to.
So it's a bit of a shift away from we're right, you're wrong. It's a question of this is slightly better than what you're offering, a better and worse scenario rather than right and wrong, which is an interesting way to look at things. I don't know.
It would be nice if it was right and wrong.
If I could cut in that whole idea about people coming together, but I feel as if that analogy with the meteorite, I feel it's already happening. It's happening right now. The Amazon rainforest has been literally burning. I think the statistic is that the amount of carbon released is 1 year's worth of Australia's. And Australia has a very high carbon emission because our government tends to lie about it. But anywho, I mean, our planet is burning. Imagine a comet, except it's already hit.
Yeah.
Are we going to come together? I mean, is that the thing? I mean,
look, I would like it to be, but it just doesn't seem to be. And there's this thing that, like, when I do work with young people around philosophy, I get both really optimistic and a bit pessimistic as well. I get really optimistic because I think your generation have got access to so much great wisdom, and you're enculturated in a way that helps you to see greater levels of diversity and deal with it in ways that were harder when people grew up in a much more monocultural kind of world. So just being exposed to diversity gives you some of the tools to negotiate better. And I think that is really wonderful, and that makes me really optimistic. What makes me pessimistic is, so I asked a question the other day to a bunch of Year 9 students, and I said, if you had to choose one word to describe your picture of the future, what would that one word be? It's just a one-word exercise, right? So let me try that here. What would the one word be?
Innovative.
Innovative. Interesting. Okay, why innovative?
Because a lot of technology is going to improve by then, I reckon.
And do you see the word innovative as being a positive or a negative word, or an ambiguous?
A positive.
As a positive?
Yeah.
Like a saving grace kind of thing?
Perhaps.
Like, there is climate change, 2050, no more ice or whatever, but innovation's going to come in and save it, sort of thing?
Sure.
So like geoengineering or something like that.
Yeah.
Interesting. What would yours be?
Oh, it's difficult, because I think there's two approaches to it. You can look at yourself in your own life, and I generally, I'm happy with the life and where I'm going to go, and I feel as though that's going to be good. But then I look at the bigger picture of the world, and it starts to look a little bit more bleak.
So
not as good.
Pick a word. Oh. It's hard.
The bleak sounded good.
Bleak.
I'll go with bleak.
Go with bleak. So when I asked this class of Year 9 students, not a single word that they suggested was positive.
Oh, really?
So every single one was similar to bleak. And that really troubled me. That really troubled me to think that there is a lot of pessimism amongst your generation, to think about all the things that are going on in the world, or a lot of inaction.
You turn on the news and all you see is, the Middle East is not happy. climate change isn't good. Schools are being, gun
Mass
violence in
shootings,
America. I mean, 200 and something or other in a year. It's hard not to feel that way sometimes.
You're right. It is hard not to feel that way, and so this is this is something I'm really kind of conflicted about, because I'm also very optimistic about your generation. I think that you've got so much capacity to do amazing things in the world and to fix a lot of the problems. There's so much inertia from the 20th century, from the baby boomer generation, who grew up enculturated in a very different world, and they've brought a lot of that baggage along with them. And that's kind of resisting a lot of change. And I'm a Gen Xer, right? So my generation is almost invisible. We don't have a lot of political power. We're fewer in number than the people who are older and the people who are younger than us. And so whatever vision of the world that we have, it's very unlikely that Gen Xers are going to have enough numbers to be able to change the world, which is actually, I've got to say, one of the reasons why, as a Gen Xer, I really value doing philosophy in schools, because where I might not have much of a voice during my own lifetime directly, if I can help influence people to think better and to come up with really good arguments, your generation has got a much greater chance of making much greater changes in the world than mine does. And so this is one of the things that motivates me. But I kind of do worry that the negativity might be demotivating. And in some ways, the world is better than it's ever been. There's less violence in the world. There's more wealth in the world. We are something like 15 times wealthier by just GDP per capita than we were something like even 100 years ago or something like that. We're not 15 times happier, which is an interesting thing. But, there's so many things that are getting better, but yet because of the news, we get exposed to all these negative things, and I worry that can kind of freak us out. I mean, do you think you get exposed to too many... The news is too negative? Do you think you hear enough about the good things that are going on?
Well, there's more of a focus on the negative things because that sells, right? I mean, that gets more attention in. So...
It's negative, but at the same time, it's also real.
Mm-hmm.
We can't discount that it's negative, but if we only got shown the positive, then, there wouldn't be what's really happening.
So you'd want a realistic depiction of what's going on in the world. So, for example... when I was about your age, HIV was a huge problem. It was an incurable disease at that point. Right now, HIV is just a chronic disease that's managed and it's not life-threatening. That's incredible. When I was your age, there were many, many cancers that were considered to be lethal. Your survival rate in 5 years was very, very low. Now there are very, very few that are like that. Things like breast cancer, which used to be incredibly widespread, and it still is, used to be have a very high lethality. Now it's very, very manageable. There are these things that we probably don't realize. Things have gotten so much better in terms of like our health, in terms of our wealth, in terms of all these other things. But we don't really hear stories about HIV being kind of reduced in lethality. We don't really hear very many stories about the change in the baseline that underscores wealth and that underscores health and all this kind of stuff. We only hear about the spikes of terrible things that happen, like gun violence, or the spikes of things like inequality or something. So I worry. I mean, do you think we're getting a realistic picture of the world?
I mean, would we know if we were getting even if we were? Right. Like, how would we know?
How would you know? Yeah.
It's hard to know what's happening on the other side of the planet when you're just going to school every day.
Well, there's so much trust put in on the news agencies to do their job of being unbiased and presenting the facts in an accessible and meaningful way. Are we only seeing the news as ABC wants us to see it? Even the ABC has bias. I find that quite difficult to find a way through. Do you guys listen to a lot of news? Have you got a preferred news broadcaster?
I listen to ABC too.
Okay.
Sometimes, yeah.
Do you listen to more than one, or just go for one?
Usually just one.
It's really interesting because what I've started to do is just to start, contrasting. I listen to a lot of Al Jazeera, which is great because it's the same news but from a totally different perspective. And all of a sudden, you then started to appreciate that this bias is really so intrinsic in what we listen to. It's so westernised, it's so Australia, and yet there's a bigger, wider picture. Give it a go. Listen to Al Jazeera.
I do. They're good. I like them.
Yeah.
SBS is.
Yeah, that's a good one as well because that's got a more wider global perspective.
Yeah. Every time I watch Channel 7 or Channel 10 or Channel 9, I feel it's the same thing every time. It always comes on with this new pill can help with this some sort of thing, and they're making it, and it's just I swear I saw that last week.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Isn't the project quite biased in its views?
Yeah.
Is it pretty sure?
I'd say so. Yeah.
Yeah. In what way?
I feel like they're less news, more where celebrities telling the news.
Yeah, it's more like
Yeah.
showing or like letting the audience know what they want to hear, what they want to know,
Oh, right.
confirming like the views that they have. So like, they're like, oh, they have my views.
I watched it last night, and all the stuff was more like, NAPLAN doesn't work anymore. And then when you said that, I was like, yeah, if you watch that segment, and for instance, we did NAPLAN, of course we didn't like it, and then it was alright. And you did it, and then you watch that, and you say, yes, NAPLAN doesn't work. Someday my kids won't have to do it.
Yeah, it's like they have my view.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting.
Is Waleed Ali still on the project?
Yes.
Is he?
He's like the front man for it.
Good.
Was
I
he the main guy?
haven't seen it in a number of years, but he was always the draw card for me because he again offered a different perspective. You know, he's an educated perspective. He comes from a legal background, and he's just got a way of putting things over that I found really clear and easy to understand. But then they had a few of those guys trying to be funny.
The comic relief.
Yeah, that was sort of lost
Peter
it for me a
Hellier.
little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So but that's my take on it.
No, and I'm a huge admirer of Waleed Ali. I think he's one of the clearest thinkers and sophisticated thinkers in Australia at the moment. And he's able to really break down and digest really complex topics. And often in the media cycle, there's something that happens and everyone kind of gets fixed on a particular way of looking at it or a particular narrative. And I like that Waleed is able to kind of step back a little bit and see a bigger picture and say there's a larger thread going on here. I'm a huge admirer of the work that he does. I mean, I don't always agree with him. It would be weird if I agreed with anyone all the time, right?
Exactly.
But I admire the way that he also presents his ideas. I think he also gives justice to things he disagrees with as well. He gives them a go.
Yeah. So there you go. Someone to emulate and model yourselves on with, quite a character. That's right.
How are we doing for time, Nathan?
We're at 30.
All right. Where do you see moral philosophy in 2,000 years from now? Yeah, that's quite a far.
Oh, geez. Right. Okay, well, let's think. Where was it 2,000 years ago?
Yeah.
Right? So 2,000 years ago, around the time of, say, ancient Greece, getting into the time of ancient Rome, there was actually a surprising diversity. Maybe not that surprising. There were a number of different kind of ethical theories bouncing around. In fact, let's go back 2,500 years. Right. There's a really fascinating time 2,500 years ago, right, where around the same century, around the 6th to the 5th century BC, the three great kind of philosophical traditions in the world emerged in that same window, right? So in ancient Greece, you've got the kind of Greek philosophers, which is the Western tradition, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, etc. In China, you had Confucius, you had Lao Tzu, so you had the beginnings of Confucianism. You also had the beginnings of Taoism, and those two forces have been incredibly influential in China. And then in India, you had Gautama Buddha, who kind of came up with Buddhism, which was building on and reforming, in a way, the longer Hindu and the Vedic tradition. And it's so interesting that in that 500-year period, these three huge kind of pillars of our thinking around the world emerged. And I'm kind of overlooking there, and it's probably unfair to overlook all the other traditions that were going on in many other places in the world. But so there was a huge diversity then. I actually think in 2,000 years there's probably going to be just as much diversity. But I would hope that our factual understanding of the world is so much better that we can better inform our moral decisions. So even if you've got a moral theory, like even if you're a consequentialist and you think that the outcomes are really important, and there's the outcomes that matter are whether people are happy or sad, you've got to be able to determine whether people are happy or sad. And so there's a factual matter there where you've got to go out into the world and ask people and test them somehow, or find some way of determining whether the fact of whether they're happy or sad, and then you can inform the decisions that will make them happier or less sad, That aspect of it, understanding the way the world is, understanding our psychology, understanding our biology, understanding our culture, that kind of stuff hopefully will have improved a lot. And so there may still be a huge diversity of moral views, but we may be able to be better at implementing them in a kind of a more effective way. That's if we make it for 2,000 years, just to put a bit of a pessimistic spin on it. But I think there's every likelihood that we will. So that's what I hope to be the case.
Do you think those original thinkers had it easier as thinkers back then?
Oh, yeah.
Because no one else had thought
anything.
They came out and said, let's not kill each other.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And
Hey
then,
guys.
and then people agreed, but nowadays it's, they've already had all the good ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I mean, wouldn't it be great to be the first person who not just slipped into a bath and saw the water rise and come up with the idea of displacement and go eureka, right? I mean, Archimedes or whoever. I mean, there's stories about whether he learnt from others. These being the first person to come up with those ideas, that's great, right? Particularly if they haven't been perpetuated at that point. But you're right. What's really interesting today is we do have a lot of ideas. But there's still a lot of disagreement. And that kind of goes back to an earlier point that I'm saying, which is the big problem today is not solutions. No matter what problem you name, whether it's something scientific, whether it's ethical, whether it's climate change, whether it's clean energy, whether it's resolving the conflict in the Middle East, we have lots of solutions that I think can work. It's just a matter of the difficulty now is getting people to use them, to do them, to convince them. To put aside their biases, to put aside the other baggage that is preventing them from implementing them. So the new ideas, I mean, we don't need many more new ideas. We just need, we don't need new solutions, except one, which is a solution to how to convince everyone to adopt a solution.
That's a pretty good way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, do you think we are running out of original ideas, or can you?
In what sense? What do you mean by that?
I did drama for a year, and the drama teacher said that there are no more original movies or plays, because the ancient Greeks, they just came up with it all.
Or Shakespeare, or someone did.
If you watched a movie, then you think it's original, it's already been done.
Yeah. When I was doing my PhD, and I mentioned before, like this idea that morality is something we negotiate and we figure it out, and I drew a lot of evolutionary stuff around that. Someone reminded me, you should go back to Plato and read this section in his most famous book, The Republic. And so I went back and read that. And there's a joke that was made in the early 20th century by a mathematician and philosopher called Alfred North Whitehead, who worked with Bertrand Russell and kind of reinvented mathematics. Fascinating guy. And he made this joke to say that all of philosophy for the last 2,000 years is just a series of footnotes to Plato. So it's all just responses to things that Plato's already said. And so when I went back and I read that section, I'm like, oh man, there's a guy in this called Glaucon, and he basically proposes exactly the same thing that I was proposing. This kind of social contract negotiation thing, right? And I was like, so I'm just another footnote to Plato. But I mean, of course, I was developing it in other ways and kind of going in other directions, looking at other implications. Yeah. But maybe those new ideas were already kind of there. So when it comes to, are there genuinely new ideas? Look, I do think that there are still some. And I do think there are still some in the arts as well. Maybe it's the economics of the media that, they do one superhero film, it does really well, so they're just going to do a whole lot more, right? Until people run out and they're going to have to try to innovate somewhere else. I think there is still a huge amount of innovation going on. There's this huge amount of experimentation going on. We just don't necessarily see it. What often happens in the media aspect of it is, and I know this from working in magazines and websites, is a small player somewhere will experiment with something because it's low cost. They give it a try. If it doesn't work, hey, no big deal, they'll try something else. And if it works really well, then all the big players will copy it and start using it. But the big players, they've got so much invested in the way they do things, they're really reluctant to experiment because if they get it wrong, the cost is going to be huge. So a lot of the innovation and a lot of the new ideas is coming from these lower level things that we don't often hear. And I think that's the same in the arts, but I think it's the same in philosophy and science as well. Sometimes it's the undergrads who come up with great new ideas about how to do things. And it eventually bubbles its way through, and then we have some kind of revelation about it, and it changes. So I do think that there's almost infinite capacity for human imagination. And I've got a lot of faith in the power of that creativity and imagination. There's a lot of pressure to constrain us to conform in particular ways. In fact, one of the things I love about Australian philosophy and Australian academia is Australian scientists and philosophers are known all around the world for being really creative and original thinkers. And there's something about our culture here that maybe because we're less deferential to authority, like in the US and in Europe and in Asia, there's a sense that you've got to respect the authority figures and you don't want to disagree with them too much. And in Australia, it's like, no, mate, I disagree with you. I think you're wrong, and here's why. And so these Australians who travel overseas as scientists or philosophers do really, really well, particularly by coming up with new ideas and arguing them really effectively. And I think it's a real virtue of Australian culture, encouraging people to be bold and back their ideas, even if everyone around you disagrees. I think that's a good thing.
Oh, there you go. I think you have one final question.
Do we have one final question?
Can I throw in a question before your final question?
Yep.
A penultimate question.
So I've been doing a little bit of background research, and I found your website called Occams Beard.
Yes.
And how did that name come to be? Because I know that there's a thing called Occams Razor, which is what Damien has tried to explain to me countless times.
Mm-hmm.
But
I'm sorry.
yeah, no, I appreciate it. But,
Yeah, right.
can you explain it?
Yeah, sure. So Occam's Beard is the name that I've kind of just given to my business. The first and most obvious answer is that I have a beard, and I've almost always had a beard since I could grow a beard, and I probably will continue to have a beard for as long as I can. I'm also very fond of Occam's Razor, and Occam's Razor is from William of Occam, the Middle Ages theologian and philosopher, and he just said the simplest explanation is often the best. I mean, he said it in Latin, which sounds a lot better, but I can't remember the Latin. Multiplicator of entities or something like that. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity or something like that. And all it just means is when you've got all these different options on the table, the simplest one is usually the best. It's not always true, but it's usually a good heuristic, a good rule of thumb to use to help guide your decision-making process. And I've been really fond of that, but it made me think about why is it not obvious? Why is it not obvious to say to people the simplest explanation is often the best? And that made me think of the beard that the razor is supposed to shave, which is, I think, our tendency to complicate things. It's our tendency to look into the world, try to make sense of it, and come up with just the first theory that we have and run with it. So there's lightning bolts coming out of the sky. Oh, well, maybe there are spirits that are angry. Good enough. It seems simple, right? But we've actually made it more complicated. Because in order for those spirits to exist, there needs to be a spirit world. In order for that spirit world to exist, there needs to be some kind of relationship between that world and this world. In order for that to be the case, metaphysics needs to be really different. Physics needs to be really different. We've actually complicated things tremendously. And so I think Occam's Beard speaks to the necessity of Occam's Razor, which is just a reminder that the way that we intuitively think, the way that we automatically think, can often be deceptive. And this is one reason why I'm very skeptical of common sense. We often use the term common sense to be, oh, look, here it's obvious, right? The answer, it's just common sense. All I think that happens when you say common sense is like, here's the way I assume the world to be, and given the way that I assume the world to be, what I'm saying right now just fits right in with that. And that's really, it's obvious, it's common sense. But if someone disagrees with the way that you see the world, you saying that your view is common sense is not going to convince them, because you haven't addressed the actual difference in your views, which is the way that you see the world. So this, to me, is this idea that our intuitions can be misleading. And that is why we need Occam's Razor, and that, to me, is Occam's Beard.
Awesome.
There's an answer to your question.
All right.
My question?
Final question.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, it's a pretty big question. If you could be any component of an aircraft, what aircraft component would you be, and why?
Oh, any component of an aircraft. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I'm always fond of those wingtip, those little wingtip things that come on there. And what I love about them, right, is because aircraft work perfectly well when the wing is flat and that just the wings stop. But when you put those wingtips on, they create these little vortices that suck air across the top of the wing and make the wing lighter. And it increases lift significantly for such a tiny little bit that you tack onto the ends of the wings. And I'm saying this because I'm a bit of a plane nerd. When I was growing up as a kid, I got really, really interested in aeronautical engineering for a long time, and I thought I was going to become an aeronautical engineer, and then I realized you have to do a lot of maths to be good at it, and I'm not very good at maths. So I gave up my aspirations of aeronautical engineering. But I remember reading these things and like, that's incredible, right? This plane works really well, but you put these tiny little things on there And it can completely change the flow of the air around it and really radically change the way the plane flies. So I like that idea. I like that idea of just tweaking something small, something efficient, improving what's already there, and suddenly it works a lot better. So that's, I think, going to be my answer.
Cool. That's probably the best answer we've got.
Most intellectual answer, yeah.
Just a bit of context. That's the question that all the guests get asked right at the very
Oh,
end.
really? What are
Yeah.
some of the other answers?
Most of them are
The black box usually.
Oh, the black box
quite
'cause it
popular
survives.
ones. Yeah.
It's either because it survives, or we had one. It was they want to be able to tell the person who finds them what went wrong.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
totally. I
It's
love that
also
idea.
someone said they want to be found first after a crash.
Right. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think that was Cameron actually.
We got.
We got, I think, the toilet or the bathroom.
Yeah, that was a
maybe?
very odd response.
I think that was mine actually.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Let's not probe that one.
Caitlin wanted to be the windows.
The windows, yes.
Oh, okay.
Windows, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was the right wing engine.
The right wing engine, not the left wing
Not
engine.
the left
No,
one.
no,
No,
that
definitely not that one.
one.
It's
Cool.
nothing political. It's just I like the right side.
The right. That's cool.
Ooh.
That's really interesting. Great questions.
Yeah.
Alright.
I think that's it. Thank you for coming on,
Thank
Tim
you.
Dean.
Thank you
And
so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for coming on, Mr. Rogers.
Oh no, thank you. Look, I've just got to say, this has been one of the highlights of my time at St Mark's because I listen to you
Really?
guys every single week. Yeah, no, you're embarrassed, but I have to prove these podcasts for their suitability before
Yeah.
they go live.
Yeah.
Never thought I'd ever be on one, so this is fantastic for me.
Dream
So
come
thank
true.
you. It's been a real pleasure.
Right. Thank you.
Great job. I love it.
So that's been an Afterhours podcast. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
And yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
See ya.
Later.